It's funny what ends a marriage. Not just a marriage, an 11-year chunk of your life. You expect a Hollywood production, screaming matches, slam doors, maybe a dramatic revelation during a thunderstorm. For me, Thomas, it ended with a barely audible buzz. A quiet, synthetic vibration on Clara's nightstand that sliced through the pre-dawn silence more effectively than any gunshot. She was in the shower, the gentle hiss of water, a generic, soothing soundtrack for the absolute demolition of my world. Her iWatch screen came to life, a small, malevolent rectangle glowing in the gloom. A message from Mark, one of her trendy new friends from the gallery scene I never quite fit into. It read, "He still doesn't know about our secret. Winky face." That winky face emoji. Pure genius. A perfect little digital stab. My first reaction wasn't fury. It was a cold, detached critique of his punctuation. Amateurs. There should have been a question mark. Then, the physics of the room changed. The air felt thick, heavy. I could smell the expensive lavender shampoo she used, a scent I used to find comforting, the scent of home. Now it smelled synthetic, like a cheap air freshener trying to cover up something rotten. For a full minute, I just stared at the watch. This tiny gadget, a 5th anniversary gift, had become a window into a life I had no part in. My life hadn't shattered into a million pieces. No, it had simply been replaced with a flawless, terrifying replica. Everything looked the same, the rumpled sheets, the half-read book on her pillow, but none of it was real anymore. What do you do when the floor beneath you vanishes but you're still standing? My first coherent thought was primal, almost cartoonish. I'm changing the locks. The sheer satisfying finality of it. Then the real joke landed. This house, our stable foundation, as my parents had called it when they handed us the keys as a wedding gift, wasn't mine to lock. The irony was so thick I could have spread it on toast. When she walked out, wrapped in a fluffy white towel, steam curling around her like a halo, she saw the look on my face, and her smile faltered. She knew. The excuses were a masterclass in deflection, a predictable cascade of, "It's not what it looks like," and "Mark is just a jerk. It was a stupid joke." A real bummer of a performance, frankly. I almost felt pity for her lack of imagination. But the real plot twist, the sucker punch I never saw coming, arrived via telephone an hour later. I called my mom, expecting, maternal rage on my behalf, a port in the storm. Instead, I got a lesson in brand management. "Thomas, marriage is complicated," she said, her voice dripping with a chilly sort of disappointment. "In me. Clara made a mistake, but you two have built a life." It wasn't about our happiness. It was about assets, appearances, the pristine image of the family she had so carefully constructed. The facade was more important than the foundation. Listening to my own mother prioritize my cheating wife's comfort over my reality, it finally crystallized. I was utterly and completely alone. And in that moment, instead of despair, I felt a strange, cold sense of power. There was nothing left to lose. Being on your own, it turns out, begins with quiet logistics. There's no dramatic exit music, just the mundane click of a laptop trackpad. I walked over to our shared home office, a space we'd meticulously designed with matching oak desks on a Zoom therapy budget, and logged into our joint bank account. I didn't empty it. That would have been an act of passion, of messy emotion. Instead, I created a new transfer. Recipient, Thomas Spencer. Amount, exactly 50% of the total balance, down to the last cent. I'm not a monster. I'm just meticulous. I hit confirm, and with that single, silent action, a decade of shared financial life was surgically severed. The next click was the printer. I printed a blank set of divorce filing forms I'd found online and placed them squarely in the middle of the cold granite kitchen island, right on the spot where she'd left a half-empty mug of coffee that morning.
Then I grabbed my pre-packed duffel bag and walked out. The thud of the deadbolt sliding into place behind me was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in years. Within minutes, my phone began vibrating like a trapped bird against my thigh. First Clara, then my mother, then Clara again twice in a row. A digital storm of feigned panic and genuine indignation. I let them all go to voicemail, picturing their faces, a small, petty pleasure that I felt I'd more than earned. I checked into a brutally anonymous hotel downtown, the kind of place that smells of industrial cleaner and quiet desperation. Lying on the stiff, starchy sheets, staring at the textured ceiling, I finally listened to the messages. Clara's was a predictable, tear-soaked performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. My mother's was the real work of art. Her voice was cold, clipped, weaponized disappointment. "Thomas, this is not how we handle things. You're creating a public mess. You need to come home and fix this." It was never about fixing me or my broken heart. It was about fixing a public relations problem. We weren't a family. We were a portfolio. Just as I was contemplating the sad irony of it all, my phone lit up with a different kind of notification. A text from a name I hadn't seen in a while. Pete, an old college buddy who had been quietly shuffled out of our social circle years ago, a casualty of what I now realized was Clara's systematic curation of our lives. His message was short, stripped of any bullshit. "Dude, just heard. Don't believe a word she says. Call me. This isn't the first time." The stale, recycled air in the hotel room suddenly felt 20 pounds heavier. The words just hung there on the screen, a hyperlink to a version of my past I apparently had been living in blissful ignorance of, a symbolic gravestone for every memory I'd ever cherished. My thumb hovered over the call button, a tremor running through my hand. Making that phone call meant agreeing to set fire to what little was left of my life's pleasant illusions. Did I really want to know what was under that final ugly rock? You ever make a phone call you know is the emotional equivalent of swallowing broken glass? My thumb trembled for a second, then pressed down hard. I hit send. Pete answered on the first ring, his voice stripped of his usual cheerful bullshit. "Tom, man, I'm sorry." There was no awkward preamble. He just got into it, a verbal demolition expert dismantling the shoddy architecture of my marriage. He'd known, not just suspected, known for years. He explained Mark was just the sloppy rookie who got caught. The main event, the real professional, was years ago. He painted a picture of a work conference in Chicago maybe 5 years back, the one Clara came home from looking exhausted but inspired. He mentioned another guy, some pretentious yogi from her studio, back when we were still just engaged. Pete and a few others had seen the too long glances, the private jokes, but no one knew how to detonate a bomb in their friend's living room. "She has this way of making you feel like you're the crazy one for even asking," he said. The line hit me like a physical blow. It was the truest thing anyone had said to me all week. All those little inconsistencies, the late nights she swore were about deadlines, the sudden fierce privacy about her laptop, the phone calls she'd take on the porch, they all snapped into a new, hideous alignment. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was a chump. A first-class, grade-A idiot who'd goofed and smiled his way through a decade-long con. The rage I expected still wasn't coming. Instead, there was just this spreading coldness, a kind of internal frostbite. My own memories felt like a contaminated crime scene.
Then Pete dropped the final piece. The man from the Chicago conference had a name. Julian Croft.
The name wasn't just a name, it was a jolt of memory. A slick private equity guy we'd met once at a charity gala. He had that effortless old money confidence that made me instantly aware of how poorly my rented tux fit. He'd shaken my hand while looking over my shoulder, dismissing me with a polite smile that was more insulting than any slur. The bitter taste of the stale hotel coffee in my mouth seemed fitting. It finally clicked. This was never just about a cheap thrill. It was about an upgrade. She'd found someone who represented everything I wasn't. Wealthy, powerful, important. My betrayal wasn't a mistake, it was an audit, and I'd failed. Staring at my own pale, ghost-like reflection in the dark screen of the hotel TV, I realized this wasn't about love or passion at all. This was a hostile takeover of my life, and the vague idea I'd had of taking a trip to clear my head suddenly sharpened into a hard, diamond-like point. Oh, I was still taking a trip, but I wasn't running away. I was going to New York. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Personally, I was leaning toward serving it meticulously planned, beautifully executed, and with a stunning view of the Manhattan skyline. New York City was no longer an escape. It was an objective. My feelings had transcended simple hurt and entered the realm of strategy. My sterile hotel room, which hours ago had felt like a prison cell, now felt like a command center. I flipped open my work laptop. I'm a senior marketing analyst. My entire professional life is about finding patterns in the noise, sifting through mountains of data to understand what makes people tick, what they desire, and most importantly, what they're afraid of losing. I'd use those skills to sell overpriced smart home devices and artisanal coffee subscriptions. Screw it. Time for a passion project. The name felt alien in my search bar. Julian Croft. His digital footprint was a masterpiece of corporate sanitation. A polished LinkedIn profile, a few carefully curated photos of him sailing on his wife's Instagram, a board membership at some high-minded arts foundation. He was the perfect picture of a modern master of the universe. A real jerk, in my professional opinion. Was it a slight breach of company policy to leverage our six-figure data subscription services for a personal deep dive on my wife's lover? Probably. Did I give a heck? Not even slightly. I filed it under proactive emotional recovery. It took me 3 hours and 4 cups of terrible coffee, but then I found it. A tiny digital thread to pull. Julian Croft was slated as the keynote speaker at the Future Forward Finance Summit in Midtown Manhattan. In 3 weeks. My company sends a handful of junior associates to that soul-crushing networking fest every year. I was always in the perfect dead zone. Too senior to be sent as a grunt, not senior enough to go as a decision-maker. I was professionally invisible. The perfect middle manager from Boston. A role I now saw I'd been playing in my own marriage. A new plan, cold and sharp and deeply satisfying, began to take shape. I pulled up a network map of Julian's corporate connections. A beautiful, complex web of influence. A spider's web, really. I wondered what it would feel like to be a fly. A very clever, very patient fly. I leaned back in the lumpy hotel chair, the first genuine smile in a week touching my lips. Then I opened my work email client. "Hi, Linda," I typed to my boss, my fingers dancing on the keyboard. "Read the NYC Summit. I've been giving it some thought, and I believe my presence could bring significant value this year. I'd be honored to lead the team." Game on. You know you've entered a truly weird chapter of your life when a corporate finance summit in a soulless Midtown Manhattan hotel feels like you're slipping behind enemy lines. For 2 days I was a ghost in a reasonably priced suit. I collected my name badge, Tom Spencer, Senior Market Strategist, and it felt less like an identity and more like a costume. The main ballroom was a cavern of forced networking, humming with the drone of 1,000 overlapping conversations. The air was a potent mix of expensive cologne and quiet desperation. It was the perfect place to be invisible. I nursed a bottle of complimentary water at the back of the room, and I watched. I watched Julian Croft. He was good. He moved through the crowd like a shark, all charisma and perfect teeth, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that I knew for a fact weren't funny. He was a master of his universe, and seeing him in his element, I understood Clara's fascination. But I wasn't watching for his strengths. I was scanning for a weakness, a crack in the perfect facade. Everyone has cracks. My moment came on day 2, near the lukewarm buffet of mini quiches and sad-looking fruit skewers. I spotted him in a tense, hushed conversation with a smaller, sweatier man who kept adjusting his glasses as if they were slipping off his sheer panic. This wasn't schmoozing. This looked like a debriefing gone horribly wrong. My analyst brain, the only part of me is still functioning on pure logic, kicked in. I discreetly pulled up the conference attendee list on my phone and cross-referenced it with the leadership roster of Julian's firm. Bingo. Michael Vance, Chief Financial Officer. 10 minutes later, I engineered my opportunity. As Michael reached for a coffee, I accidentally bumped his elbow, sending a splash of hot liquid over his hand. "Oh, shoot, man, I am so sorry," I said, all practiced Boston sincerity, handing him a wad of napkins. As he was flustered and dabbing at his skin, I leaned in closer, dropping my voice. "Heck of a crowd. Couldn't help but notice. Tough times with that SEC inquiry, huh?" I had no idea if there was an SEC inquiry. It was a complete, wild, Hail Mary bluff, a shot in the dark based on nothing more than a sweaty palm and a panicked whisper. Michael Vance froze. For a full 3 seconds, he just stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was far too real to be faked. Then, every last drop of color drained from his face. Bullseye. The laminated badge on my chest suddenly felt like a shield and a weapon. The quiet, invisible guy from Boston had just found a live nerve. Michael's hand, surprisingly strong, shot out and grabbed my forearm. His fingers dug into my sleeve. "We need to talk," he whispered, his eyes darting around the ballroom like frightened birds. "Not here. The bar across the street, half an hour." And just like that, the rules of the game shifted. This wasn't about a broken heart anymore. This was about leverage. The bar was one of those places trying desperately to be an old-school New York institution, all dark oak, cracked leather, and the lingering scent of a century of bad decisions. It was the perfect confessional. I was 10 minutes early, nursing a club soda, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of afternoon light. Michael Vance practically fell through the door exactly 30 minutes later, looking like he'd been chased through the streets. He didn't even make it to a stool, just stood at the bar and ordered a scotch, which he downed like it was medicine. "Who are you?" he finally managed, his voice a shaky whisper. I took a slow sip of my drink. "Nobody you know," I said, keeping my tone even, neutral. "Just a guy who pays attention when people are nervous." I let the silence stretch out between us, an uncomfortable, almost humming void. One of the first things you learn in data analysis is that people hate a vacuum. They will rush to fill it with information. He didn't disappoint. "It's Julian," he blurted out, the name sticking in his throat. "He's been creative with the quarterly earnings for years." My heart gave a little kick, a jolt of pure predatory excitement. I kept my face a mask of mild interest. hiding losses in shell corporations, shifting numbers to keep the stock price inflated for the investors. Mr. Master of the Universe, the charismatic pillar of the community, was just another cheap crook in a $3,000 suit. How beautifully, wonderfully predictable. He swore it was just a temporary bridge, a way to ride out a downturn, Michael rambled on, his confession gathering speed. But now we're facing a buyout from a major competitor. If they do a real deep-dive due diligence, we're not just ruined, we're talking prison for both of us. He stared at me, his eyes pleading, desperately seeking an ally. You mentioned the SEC. They've already opened a file. And here was the real twist, the beautiful, darkly comic punchline to my whole insane gamble. They hadn't. There was no inquiry. I had simply looked at this terrified man and guessed the exact shape of his ghost. I was a nightmare he had conjured all by himself. Suddenly, my little crusade for personal vengeance felt almost laughably small. This was bigger. This was a lit stick of dynamite, and I was holding it. This crossed the line from a morally gray area into a full-blown federal crime. It was a mess that could not only ruin Julian, but could drag me and this pathetic, sweating accountant down with it. He looked down at the perfectly round, wet spot his empty glass had left on the mahogany bar. A perfect circle of condensation, like the crater left by an asteroid. "So, what do you want?" Michael whispered, the question hanging in the stale air. A damn good question. What did I want? What did I want? The question rattled around my skull as I walked out of the bar, leaving Michael to order his third scotch. The New York City street was a chaotic symphony of sirens, horns, and a million overlapping conversations, but all I could hear was that desperate, whispered question. The easy answer was simple revenge. The primal part of my brain wanted to see Julian Croft's curated world burn to the ground. I wanted him to feel that sickening lurch in his gut, that feeling of the floor giving way that I felt when I read that message on Clara's watch. But the easy answer felt cheap now, unsatisfying. This was no longer about a personal vendetta. I was holding a piece of information that wasn't just a bullet. It was a bomb that could vaporize a company, erase fortunes, and yes, very likely land me in a world of legal trouble I couldn't begin to comprehend. The game had changed. The stakes were terrifyingly high, and a sick part of me was absolutely wired, buzzing with a feeling that was dangerously close to exhilaration. Back in the sterile silence of my hotel room, I called Pete. I kept it vague, cloaking the details in corporate jargon. I think I found some leverage on Croft, something financial. There was a long pause on the end of his line. "Tom, what are you doing?" he finally asked, and for the first time I heard genuine worry in his voice. "This isn't you." But he was wrong. The me he knew, the predictable, stable, slightly boring husband, was a carefully constructed illusion. That me died on a Tuesday morning with the buzz of an iWatch. The betrayal hadn't just broken my marriage, it had cracked open my entire personality, and I was discovering that I didn't entirely hate the man who was crawling out of the rubble. In the middle of our call, a notification popped up on my laptop screen. A new Instagram story. It was Clara. The picture was a perfectly framed shot of a wine glass, filled with red wine, held up against the backdrop of our living room. My living room. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to burn the old to make way for the new. #no regrets." That was it. The final push. She was sitting in my parents' house, toasting her new, regret-free life, while I was 200 miles away contemplating a felony. And that's when I made my choice. The plot twist wasn't whether I would use what Michael had given me. It was how. I wasn't going to the SEC. I wasn't going to be a noble whistleblower. I sure as heck wasn't going to jail for Julian Croft. My plan needed to be more creative, more personal.
On the room service tray sat the cheap coffee mug I'd been using all day. It had a tiny hairline fracture running down the side, a flaw that would eventually cause it to break. A useless piece of ceramic. Unless, of course, you use the broken shard for something sharp. My master plan began not with a clandestine meeting, but with the quiet hum of a laptop in a new, brutally overpriced apartment back in Boston. The air still had that chemical tang of fresh paint, a smell I decided was the official scent of starting over. For 2 days, I lived on a diet of bad coffee and lukewarm takeout, constructing the most important spreadsheet of my life. Michael had emailed me a password-protected file, a data dump of Julian's sins. Account numbers, falsified invoices, secret ledgers. It was a digital roadmap to his corporate apocalypse. I could have just forwarded it to a regulator and watched the fireworks from a safe distance. But that was too clean, too impersonal. My revenge needed a personal touch. It needed to be bespoke. So I started a different kind of project. I researched the private equity firm orchestrating the buyout of Julian's company, a notoriously ruthless outfit known for hostile takeovers. Then I dug deeper and found their biggest rival, a competing firm they had outmaneuvered on 3 major deals in the last fiscal year. There's no fuel quite like corporate animosity. The next step required me to go offline. I took a bus to a neighboring town and found the public library. The place smelled of old paper and dust. The keyboard I used was sticky, and a kid a few seats down was watching cartoons on a tablet, the tinny sound of laughter leaking from his headphones. It was the perfect, anonymous, grubby backdrop for corporate espionage. I created a new, encrypted email address, something untraceable, a digital ghost. Then I began to type. The subject line was a masterpiece of bait, due diligence blind spot on the Croft acquisition. The body of the email was brief, hinting at massive financial irregularities without revealing the full picture. It was a hook designed to snag a very specific kind of fish. I attached a single PDF, just one damning document from Michael's file. It was enough to prove I was legitimate, but not enough to give the whole game away. I addressed it to a senior vice president at the rival firm, a woman whose professional profile screamed killer instinct. I hit send, and the message vanished into the ether. Walking out of the library and into the crisp autumn air, my phone buzzed in my pocket. My stomach clenched, but it wasn't the response I was waiting for. It was a text from my mother. Clara is willing to go to couples counseling. I really think you should consider it, for everyone's sake. The timing was so perversely, darkly funny that I actually laughed out loud, a harsh, unfamiliar sound. They were still playing by the old rules, trying to glue the broken pieces of a cheap vase together, completely oblivious to the fact that I was now in the demolition business. Was I becoming a monster? Or was I just finally taking my turn at the controls? The line between the two was getting blurrier by the minute. The silence that followed was a special kind of torture. Every email notification, every text message alert sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I was living on a knife's edge, a feeling so foreign to my old, placid life that it felt like I was inhabiting someone else's body. My new apartment, with its bare walls and unpacked boxes, felt less like a home and more like a waiting room. I was either about to get everything I wanted or get a visit from men in dark suits with badges.
The suspense was a physical weight pressing down on me. The reply finally came, not with a bang, but with a quiet ping on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a direct response to my ghost email. It was better. It was a news alert I'd set up for Julian Croft's company. The headline read, "Goliath Equity Partners announces hostile takeover bid for Crestview Financial, citing shareholder concerns." Goliath was the rival firm. The piranhas had smelled blood in the water. My anonymous email hadn't just been read. It had been weaponized. I clicked the link, my hand trembling slightly. The article was filled with deliciously vague but menacing corporate speak, concerns over accounting irregularities, a call for greater transparency, protecting shareholder value. They were using my information to launch a full-scale corporate assault, creating a public crisis that would force the original buyers to either back out or drastically lower their offer. Julian was trapped. His tidy, profitable sale was turning into a public dissection of his company's finances, and by extension, his own. My plan had worked better than I had ever imagined. It was no longer a quiet tip-off. It was a war, and I had fired the first shot from the shadows. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a New York area code. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text appeared. "This is Julian Croft. I don't know who you are or what you've done, but you have made a grave mistake. We need to talk. Now." The threat was obvious, but beneath it, I could practically smell his panic. It was the same scent of desperation I'd smelled on Michael in the bar. A thought, cold and clear, cut through my elation. Michael was the loose end. He was the only person on Earth who could connect that anonymous email back to Tom Spencer, the quiet analyst from Boston. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. I was no longer just the puppet master. I was a player on the board. "You have made a grave mistake." I read Julian's text message a second time, then a third. A smile crept across my face. It was the first truly honest communication I'd ever received from the man. My only grave mistake was believing in a life that had been a carefully constructed lie. This was just correcting the record. But his text brought the core problem into sharp, terrifying focus. Michael Vance, my patsy, my weak link. He was the only person alive who could connect me to that anonymous email. Julian was a cornered animal, and cornered animals get vicious. He would squeeze Michael, and Michael would burst like a water balloon, showering Julian with everything he needed to know about the quiet analyst from Boston. The entire, beautifully constructed demolition would collapse, and I'd be buried in the rubble. I had to get ahead of it. I had to control the narrative one last time. My fingers hovered over the call button on his contact info. Was I really going to do this? Was I going to call the man who had ruined my life and... what? I took a deep breath, the air in my still empty apartment tasting of paint and potential. I pressed the button. He answered before the first ring finished, his voice a low, furious growl. "Who is this?" I didn't answer directly. "You know," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "For a CFO, Michael Vance is a surprisingly sweaty man. I noticed it at the conference. A man with that much to hide, you'd think he'd invest in a better antiperspirant." There was dead silence on the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in Julian's paranoid mind. "What are you talking about?" he finally said. "I'm talking about the man who holds the keys to your kingdom, the man who has been watching you cook the books for years, the man who looks exactly like the type to cut a deal with Goliath Equity Partners, maybe even the SEC, to save his own skin." It was the most beautiful lie I'd ever told. Plausible, simple, Devastating. I was handing Julian a scapegoat, a target for his rage. "You're lying," he hissed, but there was a tremor of uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" I said, letting the question hang in the air before I delivered the final, delicate twist of the knife. "Ask yourself, Julian, who had access to everything? Who knew exactly which rock to turn over? And who contacted you from a number you don't recognize while your life is publicly imploding?" And then I hung up. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter. For 10 minutes, I did nothing but watch the city lights flicker to life through my large, empty window. My revenge was complete. I hadn't just destroyed his company. I had poisoned his mind, turned him against the only other person who shared his guilt. They would tear each other apart now. A week later, I saw a small article in a financial journal. Crestview Financial's CFO had been fired amidst an internal investigation. The Goliath takeover was dead, buried under a mountain of lawsuits. Julian was ruined, not with a bang, but with 1,000 legal paper cuts. I imagined Clara seeing the news. The shiny, powerful man she'd chosen was now just another disgraced suit, another loser in a story of greed. That was the real victory. It wasn't about the money. It was about turning her prize into dust. I looked around my new apartment, at the blank walls and the quiet space. It wasn't lonely. It was a blank canvas. It's funny what ends a life, but it's even funnier what starts one.